to talk with our panelists here and get to spend time with this really amazing and important film. So I know that Dr. Jones Branch comes to us with a background in history, and Mr. Ward comes to us from his work in museum studies, and in particular with the Mitchellville community on the Sea Islands. And I'm curious to hear both of you, maybe a place where we can start is by thinking about the significance of the Sea Island communities, the Gullah communities, their histories, and how they can help us understand what Dash is doing in this film, how they might help us orient ourselves to the work that she's created and to what she wants us to understand by giving us this project. So if either or both of you would start there and think about the place of history and how that can help us think through this film.
I will yield to Dr. Jones Branch.
Oh, well, thank you. I think it's a beautifully done film, and just to date myself a little bit, I have a copy of it on VHS. Yeah. So I remember where I was when this came out, and I just always thought it was a wonderfully beautiful film. And I don't know if you all know this or not. I was born and raised in Charleston, South Carolina. I'm Gullah on both sides of my family. My mom's from the South Carolina Sea Islands. My dad is from Georgetown County, South Carolina. So what I saw in this really beautiful, well done, well made film were people I was related to, and people in the video who look very much like relatives of mine on the Sea Islands of South Carolina. And I saw them doing a lot of the things that I had heard about when I was growing up, and some of the things that I even did myself as a child, although I didn't grow up on the Sea Islands. I grew up and went to school in Charleston. When I moved away from Charleston, I was a grown woman. And it was just so beautiful on so many levels. I took pretty copious notes, and I noted things like, the newspaper on the wall and the shacks. And, I'm not ready for retirement yet, but I remember seeing some of that stuff. And I remember things like my grandmother, for example, who died back in the 70s, had a chamber pot. And again, this is in the 70s when a lot of these people did not have plumbing. And that was the case most of the time when I was a kid running around on Young's Island, Edisto Island, South Carolina, when I was growing up. But what was also important and what I saw reflected in this film was Black people's resilience and a very strong sense of history and connection to the land, but also the intergenerational tensions with some people wanting to stay and other people wanting to go because they thought there were other opportunities to be found out there. And that's a big part of my family story as well. A lot of my relatives left Young's Island, Edisto Island, in that area, and moved to New York and other parts of the North and the Midwest in some instances. But the tie to the land and to that culture was very, very strong. I distinctly remember they came back all the time just for the very things that we saw in terms of the foodways. They came back because they couldn't get shrimp straight out of the water in the Bronx. They came back because they couldn't get freshly picked okra in the Bronx. And in truth, when you go down to those places today, and I go back and forth back home fairly often, I know what it's like to pick and cut okra. I don't love it, but I've done it. I grew up on okra soup, and we knew that the word was gummo, but that's not what we called it where I came from. It was simply okra soup. I know how to make it. I make it here. My husband can't stand it, but it's wonderful food that reminds me of my ancestors. And it was all of that stuff was stuff I grew up eating: shrimps, the clams, all of that stuff. So it just really took me. It took me to a very a, an important emotional and psychological space with memories of my relatives and things that I heard from my ancestors, because this happens in 1902, and that would have been right around the time when my great great grandmother was around. My grandfather, he was born I think in 1909. He was about 20 or 30 years older than my grandmother. But those very ideas and foodways, those were things that I heard growing up. Yeah.
I think I'll piggyback off what Dr. Jones Branch added, I'm from the North Carolina coast, but I'm in the Northeast.
Mhm,
So I'm out of the corridor, the Gullah Geechee corridor.
mhm.
But I still see some similarities with my family, especially with the foodways and me growing up near the water
Uh-huh,
and the
uh,
connectivity that I can find here in the film as well.
mhm,
Uh, what I saw after seeing this, after this probably been 20 years since I seen this video, this film, so it was good to see it again.
mhm,
Um, was what I'm seeing now on the islands with the intergenerational thing that the doctor brought up, and I think it's really pertinent. I'm watching it again with a new lens
right.
now that I've been in the Low Country for the last 4 years. I'm seeing it differently because now I'm recognizing some of the same struggle, the tug of war that's still happening with young and old here now, where people are leaving
Mhm,
because they don't see the opportunities staying in the area. And so, to that end, looking at Hilton Head Island and some of the surrounding areas, there's the threat of the culture being lost because it's not being passed down, not for lack of trying, but
right,
the
absolutely.
young people are like, listen, I gotta do something different. So they're going to Atlanta, they're going to Charlotte, they're going up northeast, and
Mhm,
they're trying to find different ways of life.
mhm, mhm,
But that struggle still remains because I see the elders lamenting all the things that they used to do when they were young,
mhm, mhm.
and it is being lost because it's still a generation. Just the well, I don't want to say they didn't put the importance on it, but we also have to remember that this particular culture was basically branded as unnecessary by outsiders, early 20th century, before then. But so now, why do you talk like that? Why do you cook that way? Why do you dress that way? And so that starts to, ingrain itself
Mhm, mhm,
into the thoughts and minds of the people who are growing up. And so you have this potential, really, dangerous
mhm.
chasm that's happening where you lose much more of the culture. We're not sure you can get it back
Right,
the way that you need to. And not to start another whole conversation, I'll wrap it up so we move to the next question. You also have the land loss that's happening here.
right.
And because the land is so important and the culture is tied to the land, and the land leaves, the culture is also threatened. So it was really interesting to watch this again
Mhm, mhm.
because I do remember when it was on VHS too.
We're
So,
sort of dating ourselves here.
yeah, yeah, I'm definitely dating myself too. I
You
remember
made
that
me
being
say
on
some
VHS.
really, really, I mean, I remember all the buzz when it came out 30 years ago. I think you're absolutely right, Mr. Ward. It's not only they were being told that it was unimportant, but then a lot of the people who had moved off and gone on to other places and got an education or whatever, they came back thinking this history was unimportant. When I was growing up and when I left South Carolina, you didn't exactly tell people that you were Geechee. Now I shout it from the tallest rooftops. I want people to know that this is me, for generations all the way back to the 18th century. These are my people, right? But it had such a stigma once upon a time. Sounding Geechee, I tell people all the time, I learned how to be bilingual a long time ago. And so, if I'm on my phone talking to my people, you will hear that I'm very much from Charleston, and my Arkansas born and raised husband is like, well, I don't understand what happens when you go home, because you come back sounding so different. Well, I'm in my natural element when I go down there, but I remember that my grandmother spoke Gullah, but my mom really didn't. They were not encouraged to do that. And in many instances, they were punished because that's what uneducated, ignorant, backwood people
Right.
did. Not well educated people who are aspiring to be, something more than country folk. And so we were raised with a good bit of that, but my mom took us back and forth to the country all the time while my grandmother was living. And I've only been to St. Helens Island a couple of times because what do they have down there that I don't have in Charleston? But the beaches, I remember thinking, that's Eddie Stowe Island. That's Eddie Stowe Island, and we were there all the time. That's stopping. And I remember there was this guy named Mr. Charles, and my mom and my siblings, well, my siblings and I would ask, Mom, what is Mr. Charles saying? Mr. Charles speaking Gullah. The same Mr. Charles. We didn't understand what he was saying entirely, but we loved going to his house because we knew he would give us sugar cane, freshly cut sugar cane. He peeled it for us, and we'd be sucking on that all the way back into the city.
Wow.
Yeah, so I have memories, like that. I have memories of going crabbing. You take raw chicken, a string, and a net, real simple, and you go out in the marsh in low tide and you catch crabs. So as I watched this video, as I said, it reminded me of a lot of what I had been told, but it also reminded me a lot of what I personally experienced.
I think it's interesting. I'm sorry, and I'll be quiet now. But I think it's interesting when we're talking about the language, because there are so few people that I know personally on the island that actually speak Gullah, uh, or can go in and out of it pretty regularly. And their complaint is that the language is leaving, but
Yeah,
now it's being studied at Harvard. Right. And so you've
yeah.
got universities that picked up this conversation about Gullah culture and staying here
Well, you're
now.
from the Low Country.
I'm
He's from
sorry.
the Low Country. The
No, well,
professor,
yeah.
you from the Low Country. We got to give him his props now.
We won't deny that. But I guess what I want to put forth is now you have people who are directly benefiting off of Gullah Geechee culture that are not Gullah Geechee.
Right.
And
It's sexy
so,
now.
yeah, and
Yeah.
that becomes an issue unto itself.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, I just want to say one other thing, and then, we can move on to the next question. But, I think about downtown Charleston, where I spent a lot of my time. I remember when it was 50% or more Black.
Mhm.
This was not that long ago. This was the 90s. I remember that when there were the sweet grass baskets you saw in the movies, they were all over the place, not just in the market, which at the time didn't have anybody's air conditioning or shelter on the side, didn't have any of that. I remember that. I remember when they'd be all up and down, King Street and Meeting Street and all of those places where they cannot go now. I remember the little boys selling the palmetto roses. Now they have to have a license, so I mean, that's not something that that's only 30 years ago. Only 30 years ago. And so you're exactly right, Mr. Ward, that the very things that we were told were, as I said, unimportant or bad, the people profiting from them now are not people who are Gullah Geechee.
Right.
Mhm.
Mr. Ward, I wonder if you would maybe follow up a little bit with that. Will you say a little bit about the community of Mitchellville and the work that you're doing there, just to kind of orient people to, I think some people, may have heard of Hilton Head as this kind of, vacation destination space, and they don't know the history, of the Mitchellville community or the work that you're doing there. So would you say a little bit more about that, and maybe how that is, how you're working with some of these questions of historical transmission and trying to keep these ideas alive into the future?
Sure thing. Well, Mitchellville is the first self-governed town of formerly enslaved people in the United States, formed in 1862 on Hilton Head Island. This is after a fairly pivotal battle in the Civil War early on, November 7th, 1861, Battle of Port Royal. Only lasted about 3 hours, but it gave Hilton Head Island to the Union Army. And so when the Confederate forces left, so did everybody else who was on the island who was on plantations, except for the enslaved population. And so out of those 16 plantations, now you got these people who are there without any kind of, template of what to do next. You just are de facto freed, but considered contraband of war. And so within a couple of hours, there were about 80 people who had made their way to where the Union Army was after that battle. The next day, it was close to 400 or 500 people. So folks understood now that Hilton Head has fallen, that's where we go, because almost immediately it becomes the Department of the South for the Union Army. And so there are 30 to 40,000 Union troops on Hilton Head. And so people could escape to Hilton Head. That means they were going to be free. But initially, the overcrowding was something that the Army couldn't handle. They built these barracks that were akin to a shanty town to hold people. They weren't well regulated. There were problems there. And so David Hunter, who was the commander at the time, decided he would use Sherman's Order Number 15, which is where you find the 40 acres in the mule language, to unilaterally say, if you pick up a rifle and fight for the Union cause and you are colored, you can be free. Well, Hunter did not have that authority to do that. And he got away with it for about 2 or 3 months before Washington found out. And so Lincoln, who was friendly with Hunter, reassigned him because he didn't want to ruin his career. And so in comes Ormsby Mitchell, who, among other things, including being an astronomer, helped start the first observatory in the state of Ohio. He's also an abolitionist, and he sees this as an opportunity to really get to the heart of what they were fighting for. And so the Drayton Plantation, he gave, at least on paper, about 900 acres to the contraband. I think initially that was the number, but it ended up being maybe more like 500 to 600 acres that they actually used. And so each family got a quarter acre of a lot. There were about 3 to 4 stores. There were 4 churches. This was the site of the first mandatory school system in the state of South Carolina. Every child between the age of 6 to 15 had to go to school. They went to the business of building houses immediately, almost 4 or 5 a day. So at its height between 1862 and 1868, where the Army is connected, there are anywhere from 1,500 to 3,000 people in Mitchellville, almost 500 homes. They were governing themselves. This is the chance where nowhere else in the South are Black people voting on anything, right? The only people who could vote were white, wealthy male landowners. But at Mitchellville, you were charting your own course. So for the first time, these people went from being property to owning property, which is a humongous sea change when you think about what we're talking about at this time in the 1860s. And this community would stay pretty much intact going into the late 1880s. It would shrink after the Army leaves in 1868 because the war is over, so they relocate. And so the people also relocate, but for different reasons. Like, you can't look at Mitchellville as an experiment that didn't work. It was an experiment for its time. And so it showed, even though it's not directly included in the Port Royal experiment, which was used to try to give skills to Black people and get them integrated in a way into the American communal function. But it is the most successful experiment of the Port Royal experiment because it was actually working. And you have this thing rubber stamped by the US government, so to speak. Unfortunately, Mitchell would die about 45 days into this initiative of yellow fever, so he wouldn't even see it. But it's named Mitchellville in his honor, and Mitchell has 1 L in it, just in case, for those of you who are looking later, they're trying to find out more about Mitchellville. The reason there are no buildings left is because in 1893, there was a major hurricane in Sea Islands, the Great Sea Islands Hurricane, which was for a long time considered the greatest natural disaster in American history. Wiped out, most of the Sea Islands, killed about 2,500 people. Half of Hilton Head was underwater. And so that's why, because everything was up on piers, being so close to the water, nothing remained. So we've been able to use, through some really, really cool archaeological techniques, we've been able to place where most of the community on the spot that we have remains. So out of that 500 to 600 acres, there's only 33 acres left that's protected. We have a lease with the town owns that property. And so we're gonna take that 33 acres and turn it into a cultural attraction that talks about the importance of Mitchellville, why we should be talking about that in the 21st century. And we are going to interpret it along the themes of freedom, democracy, citizenship, and opportunity. These are all American tenets. They apply to everybody. They do not get old. They are threatened from time to time, especially recently. But those are things that anybody can connect to. And it gives us an opportunity to do even more with the stories that are surrounding Mitchellville. And so in our interpretation, we want to look at those, but key in on opportunity and citizenship. Most notably for us, our tagline is where freedom began, because we believe this was the first time that Africans in America could be citizens of a community that they are functionally in control of. And so we want to talk about what does it mean to be a citizen? What are your responsibilities as a citizen, not just locally, not just nationally, but globally? And so we're setting forth to try to make that happen on Little Hilton Head Island, which is only about 12 miles across, but sees about 2.7 million people a year in tourists. So we want to change the landscape there. We're about in the middle of right smack dab in the middle of the Gullah Geechee corridor, which goes from Wilmington, North Carolina to Jacksonville, Florida. And so one of our unwritten goals is, because there are about 1,000 sites along that corridor, the good that we do, the things that we can do to build ourselves, we'll be able to help all boats rise, and we can bring even more attention to the corridor.
That's amazing work. And what you're saying about democracy is so reminiscent for me of Nicole Hannah-Jones and the 1619 Project, and the way that she's written about Black Americans, in the periods in the 20th century as being really the people who complete and fulfill the democratic experiment in the way that the white America was never willing to, never willing to come through on the promise of democracy in the ways that Black people actually really were. So this is beautiful, beautiful work. I'm interested, let's see, let me see. So I don't see, Jasmine, I don't see the chat as an option for me on this screen. So let me invite people. If y'all have questions, will you raise hands? I should be able to see you if you raise your hand. So I want to leave people a chance to get in. I can keep asking questions all night, but I want to leave a little space if other people have questions that they'd like to ask our panelists.
Yes, feel free to raise your hand. I'm sorry about the chat function. I'm not sure why.
These, Zoom and all this, they do things that we don't really see. But Hannah, I see you out there. So do you want to just hop on and ask the question?
Hi, Dr. Jadon. Hi, everyone. I was just curious. I know you guys were talking earlier about things at Hilton Head Island, different things. I was wondering if there was places you can visit, historical places, maybe museums and stuff in that area, if there was resources there, because that'd be really interesting to see.
Most certainly. Well, you can, even though we don't have any structures, full structures up right now, we do have interpretive panels and replicas of buildings at Historic Mitchellville Freedom Park, which is right on the island, not too far from the airport, which of course, a lot of the runway is sitting on top of old Mitchellville. That's another whole conversation about how much Mitchellville stuff we will never get because of the development around it, which, is part and parcel of what we're talking about now. But also the Penn Center, which is on St. Helena Island. You can see in the credits, Emory Campbell, who lives on Hilton Head, used to be the director of the Penn Center, and is just like a wealth of information. But the Penn Center is not that far from Hilton Head Island. There's a lot of information there. In Charleston, as the good doctor has been talking about, there's the Old Slave Mart Museum. You have the up and coming, hopefully next year, International African American Museum, which will be opening in next year. That will be talking about the diaspora specifically. Because depending on what scholar you listen to, anywhere from 25 to 40% of all African Americans trace their lineage back to South Carolina. Because of course, Charleston was one of the major ports along with Mobile. So a lot of us have South Carolina roots. I'm from the coast of North Carolina, so my folks probably came through South Carolina as well. And that's just those are just a handful of sites. During normal conditions where we don't have pandemic situations, the Gullah Heritage Tours runs on Hilton Head, where they take you through all the Gullah neighborhoods on the island. The Campbells actually run that. It's an amazing experience. And I hope we can keep opening up as long as people do what they're supposed to do so they can start running again. There's the Gullah Museum on the island, which is the only structure that you can actually live in if you wanted to, right? That is still functional, that is directly related to Mitchellville era homes. It was built in 1930 by a descendant of Mitchellville. And so most of the native islanders, which would be the Gullah people, native islanders on Hilton Head are descendants from Mitchellville, and they all moved to the northern end of the island after the community started to go down because the proximity to the mainland, the soil was better, and Hilton Head is shaped like a shoe. And Mitchellville was on the back of the hill, which made it a sitting duck for storms that came in off of the water. So it was a way to also kind of protect themselves to move in. And so those communities are still there. And there are other sites that you can see along in the Low Country. There's about 500 years of history between Charleston and Savannah. And so there's all kind of material that's there. And so we're hoping that we can get these things bolstered a little bit by what we're doing. And of course, what IAM is doing as well. So we hope to, we've already made some connections with them. We hope to make sure that we can really push this history out so people can come and learn more about it.
I might add also that there are Gullah tours in Charleston as well. I encourage people to go on those tours instead of paying $50 to sit behind a horse in the heat. It's just not cute, but they pay for it. And at the College of Charleston, there's also the Avery Research Center for African American History and Culture. But just after the Civil War, that was one of the first schools established for African Americans in the city of Charleston, and it operated continuously from about 1865 until 1954. It sat in disrepair for a while. The College of Charleston purchased it, and now it's a part of the College of Charleston. And even when you go into the market now, you can still see the ladies weaving, and some gentlemen weaving the baskets. They'll give you the brochures that give you that tell you about the history of the sweetgrass baskets. Peanuts, the goobers, are a big deal in the Low Country. I remember years ago there used to be a man called Tony the Peanut Man. We used to ride around downtown Charleston and selling boiled peanuts. That's a big deal where we come from. He's since passed, but there are all kinds of things down there where people are now talking about the Gullah Geechee history. But before I left Charleston to go to Ohio to go to graduate school, I worked for the Charleston Convention and Visitors Bureau. And as I left, they were just beginning to talk about Gullah Geechee culture on places like Drayton Hall Plantation, Magnolia Plantation. Before that point, they were focusing on the horticulture and the architecture without acknowledging the people who actually did all of that work and constructed all of those buildings. But now there's a renewed emphasis on telling those stories. So, again, all the way up and down the corridor, you can find all kinds of sites telling that history now. But I do want to say, I need this to be clear, that was not always the case. That was not always the case.
There was one more, McLeod Plantation does a really active job in discussing the enslaved narrative and point of view. Like they put a lot of time and energy into shifting that old interpretation that it used to have. And so they do a pretty decent job of giving you some real information about the enslaved population there and trying to center them as part of, the true story of the plantation.
Excellent. Oh, that's super helpful. Thank you. Dr. Glick, do you want to hop in here?
Yeah, I'd like to thank everybody for joining, and it's really an honor, Mr. Ward and Dr. Jones Branch, just to have your knowledge really be part of this discussion is fantastic. And I mean, I'm curious, Jasmine, you've organized this event, and I'm curious just to hear some of your thoughts about the film and sort of what struck you, what jumped out at you, what moved you, and then also for Dr. Jones Branch and Mr. Ward. It's been great to learn about all the sort of public history efforts for this area. And I'm curious, has there been an interest in historicizing some of the visual culture, whether that's films about the region, in painting, in literature, and just sort of to what extent maybe, art and issues of representation, perhaps, things like Daughters of Dust is part of the kind of public history efforts.
Well, what I love most about this film, I think there's so many things, especially like the visuals. Like it's such a beautiful, like stunning film. But I think mostly I like the intergenerational depiction of like the women in the film and like the African culture. I think is really nice to see, especially since I haven't really been like, I haven't seen like culture like that before, and it's very authentic. But I love how there's like older generations of women, like older Black women and younger Black women in this film, and they don't conform to like an American type film. It's more just like very like inhibited in African culture, which I love to see. And I think that there isn't any like trauma or anything as like an American film would depict Black women in, which I love. Like it just shows Black women in their element, like living their lives. And I think that's really beautiful since, you know, as a Black woman myself, I don't want to always see like movies like when Black women are put down or shamed or like just depicted in a negative light. But I think this film really shows Black women and African women in a beautiful light. And I think that's something to praise about this film for sure.
I'm sorry, what was your question to me again? I was writing some notes down and then I forgot the question.
Oh, I mean, it was just a kind of general question within a lot of these public history efforts for the region. You know, has there been an attempt to historicize or to sort of engage with some of these kind of depictions in terms of film and in terms of painting, in terms of literature? You know, as there is, it sounds like more of a kind of effort to sort of teach about the history of this region and issues of race relations and land ownership and all, you know, all sorts of things. But to what extent, you know, are things like film or art, you know, more generally sort of part of these public history efforts? It was just a question.
Absolutely, absolutely. And they still do this down there, the Moja Arts Festival, for starters. That's a lot of what that's about. Increasingly, it's Spoleto Arts Festival, and you know, and again, I remember like the Spoleto Arts Festival going all the way back to the 1970s, where I didn't see any of my history in that festival. But my understanding is that that has changed in terms of the artwork. Are you familiar with the artwork of Jonathan Green? He does beautiful. Now I can't afford any of his stuff, but he does beautiful, beautiful work. I can afford a print every now and again, but the original work is above my pay grade. But the work, if you look at the artistry, and actually he's from that area, right? He's from the Beaufort area. And you will see in these images the very same kind of women that you see in the film: Black women fishing, Black women shrimping or crabbing, Black women going to church, or a picnic at the church. He really captures all of that in his artwork. And you know, I'm only a dean right now. If I ever become provost, I'm buying a piece of his work, but I can't afford it right now. But I mean, when I see that kind of stuff, it just, I get lost in it. I really do get lost in it. And I do know that he has a book of his paintings or whatever. You can purchase it on Amazon.com. And if you're ever in Charleston and you go into the market, there's a Black-owned art gallery where you can get not just prints of his work and the originals if you want them, but other artists who paint low country scenes. I go to the $5 rack. That's where I go, and I can buy about 5 or 10 of them, and I have them in my office. And you know, again, it evokes a lot of memory for me, and it reminds me of a lot of the things that my grandmother told me about. And I also wanted to say something about these Black women in this video. It shows them in all their complexity. It shows them in their beauty and in their complexity. And I do want to say that there is trauma there, but what's beautiful about the film is that there's Black trauma, but there's also Black joy. And that's the one thing that we don't see enough. There's a whole lot. I mean, these people's lives were not dismal every day. That's just not the way it works. So it shows them in their full humanity, and it shows them celebrating even during the difficult times. And that's the kind of stuff that's often lost in a lot of what we see in films about Black people. I had a colleague who called it Black porn trauma, or Black trauma porn, where you can only ever focus on Black people's difficult times as if they never had any good times. Of course they did.
Completely agree with everything, including the Jonathan Green prices. He's like the top level of Gullah artist, though. But there's others like Sonia Evans and Sabri, Amiri Ferris in the Low Country, who are really doing extremely well with this art. It is something that that people are coming down here to find. Like there is a Gullah celebration on the island in February, and there's a Gullah festival in Beaufort in May. And there are artists that are bringing their work to, the celebration on the island lasts all month of February, and they have an art show at the Art Center, and that stuff flies off the wall, and people are coming in from Canada, folks are coming in from Texas to just for the celebration, and just do the same thing for Beaufort for their week-long celebration, and they're going back with a lot of stuff. And so people are still making baskets here. Oh my gosh, I forgot Michael's last name. Michael Smalls. There we go. Michael Smalls is someone who is creating like really tremendous sweetgrass baskets here, and has a really big following. But he's not by himself. So the art is being captured. There are people writing about it. You don't see a lot of the material that you would like to see, just going deep in depth about it. But some things have already been done, and you have people around who can still talk about it. And we like to make sure we go towards authentic sources, which is why when I first got here, I had to make it really clear that I couldn't be the Gullah expert. All right. I'm coming in, this is a resort island. I'm the guy who wears a tie every day. I'm not Gullah, but because it might have seemed easier to approach me than them, right? Because of how I'm coming in from the big city of Birmingham. That people wanted to gravitate towards us, and we had to direct that traffic towards these other folks who were the actual holders of the culture. And that was very important for us. And we're still standing by that. And that's part of us trying to maintain that culture, because we're going to be really highlighting it on our site. We're not going to, and no knock against Disney, but we don't plan on Disney-fying the Gullah culture. We want to honor it, but make sure it's a part of everything that we're doing. So there's use of indigo and Haint Blue. There'll be tabby sidewalks, that the intricate patterns of sweetgrass. You'll see that, but we're not going to, I personally, and this makes people upset for some reason, I'm not doing like on-site live interpreters. We'll do it for certain projects. I do have a volunteer who does Harriet Tubman for us, because she does have a connection to the area at the Cumbia River Raid, where they freed 756 people. She personally led 100 of those folks back to Hilton Head, and they settled in Mitchellville. But other than special programs, we're not doing that because people come into the area looking for certain things that I don't believe they don't know any better, but it's not respectful. Like, you're not gonna, it's almost like folks want to kind of drive into like an arch that says Gullah Land, and then you got people walking around barefoot and shucking oysters and making gumbo, and that's just not real. These folks are living regular
No,
lives.
yeah, no, absolutely. I had a friend here who said, "Well, I'm gonna go down to the South Carolina Low Country, and I'm gonna go see the Gullah people." I said, first of all, that was a show on Nickelodeon.
That was a show in the good. It happens all the time, doctor.
Yeah,
It happens
yeah.
all the
Number
time.
two, you can't roll up in those rural areas and they don't know you, because you'll get shot.
Right. Don't
You'll
worry.
get shot. It's like they don't know you like that. I have to reintroduce myself to the environment, and I have to say, I'm kin to so and so. I'm kin to the Washingtons. My grandmama, my granddaddy were this. They built this church out on Young's Island, and then, because as far as they're concerned, I'm from off somewhere, even though I was born and raised there. So you're coming in and you're just gonna roll up to somebody's house and ask them to speak Gullah.
It won't go the way you want it to go.
It won't go the way you walking over, but you might be limping back.
Right? You might be living back.
Might be limping back.
It took me, honestly, and I tell folks, it took me about 3 months to kind of ingratiate myself in the community, because these folks don't know me. I can come in and talk about all the good that I want to do as much as I want to, but they've been burned by folks who look like me and folks who don't. So I had to gain their trust. I went to all the churches, I went to all the cookouts, I went to all the community events. I didn't ask for a thing. I just showed up. Hey, this is my face, it's who I am. And so now it's a lot better. And then I was able to gradually say, hey, look, this is my vision for what we want to do with this story because it's your story, and I want to make sure we're honoring it. And we had to do that. It doesn't make any difference that I was coming there as a Black man, like they didn't know me, and so that cultural difference, but I think that part of the culture helped protect the culture for as much as it could. Like, we were talking about it being under fire, but you can still find that culture on the Sea Islands. And part of that early on was because they were hard to get to, unless you had a boat. So that actually served as a buffer to kind of protect a lot of the culture in going into the 20th century.
Yeah, this makes me think about one of the things I would love to hear y'all comment a little bit on the film's ending and the ways that the film is approaching the members of the family who do want to go to the North and are telling this story that they're going to go for progress, right? And, Hagar's got this fantasy that she's going to have vegetable gardens and, that life is going to be amazing for her, which what we know about life in New York City, like this is not gonna, she's not well informed, right? I'm curious. I would just be curious to hear y'all meditate on the way that, like, the place that Dash leaves us, right, and the forms of continuity that we are meant to imagine at the end of the film, like how the community is going to go forward.
When I saw that scene, it reminded me of, like I said, my relatives who left the South Carolina Sea Island and went to New York, and when they would come back. And it was very much a scene like that, except they were all in a Cadillac and not in a boat. But it was that same sort of thing where, my grandmother standing outside a house that looked very much like the house in the film, and watching people go back to New York and reminding them not to forget who they are and whose they are, and giving them things to take back with them that remind them of the culture they left behind. And that continuity is important because there's a segment of people in New York City still to this day in places like Harlem, Brooklyn, and New York who can trace their roots to the South Carolina Low Country. Maybe great grandmama came from there, or they don't understand that the okra soup that they love is a Low Country tradition. So those continuities are there in the types of food that they eat, even in their reverence for the dead. This wasn't in the film, but people typically didn't wear black to funerals. They wore white. White was important, and water was important. All those things remained important. So I think those cultural continuities are the things that kept them coming back and forth to the Low Country, South Carolina. And quite frankly, in some instances, it's where they retired. After spending 40 or 50 years in New York, they came back because the land, the culture, the history, this is where their roots are. And many of them made it very clear that this is where they wanted to be buried. So yeah, you've been gone for half a century, but you are going to come back. It's sort of understood, unless you die in New York, which some of my relatives did, that you're going to come back. So it all comes full circle, right? They keep those connections to the place, to the land, to the people. And when the South Bronx became too expensive and they retired, they came back.
It's a common story.
Yeah.
Again, I'm outside of the corridor, but that Great Migration story is something that all Black people share. Like my great aunts, the uncles, they became longshoremen in Long Island. We got folks went to Jersey City. People went to Boston and worked. And as Dr. Jones-Brand said, they came back when they retired. Some of my father's contemporaries have done that in the last few years. Decided to come back, even to our small Northeast North Carolina, just to retire after being up in New York for 40 to 50 years. Because that connection to home that they didn't lose.
And the cost of living is a lot less than New York City.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, they can afford to buy a house in Charleston for what you were paying for rent in the Bronx.
Right.
So that's important.
Actually have a yard.
And have a yard.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Which means something now.
It means a lot.
Yeah. And so I saw connectivity because it's a common story, especially for Black people growing up in the South who grew up in the South and stayed in the South. They can see themselves in that last. The people who decide to stay, the folks who decide to leave, who are looking for different outcomes, and unfortunately, you don't. Everybody doesn't get the good outcome going up north. You think about not too long after this, in the teens, you got Red Summer in Chicago and all these other places where people become targeted because now you're seen as interloper who's taking jobs away. And you can see that same rumbling with our Hispanic Latino brothers and sisters over the last 20 and 30 years, where it's this threat of jobs being taken away and then violence that comes along with that. And so it's an experience as someone who always went up north to visit folks. Like one of my favorite great uncles lived in Jersey City. Every summer I was in Jersey City, but he grew up in Caratuck, which is, this small place outside of Elizabeth City, unfortunately, which has been in the news for the last couple of weeks for all the wrong reasons. And so I found some commonalities with that instinct, because it's something that you have, I guess it's another migration of people actually trying to get back here now, which is really interesting to see how the South is exploding in certain areas. And folks who's like, I'm not doing this up north anymore. I'm coming back down here, or I'm coming for the first time. They didn't grow up here, but now they're trying to migrate down because of first of all, property, right? It's a little cheaper, but also just to get away from some ways of life that they don't want to do anymore.
Right. No, that's exactly right. Because when, I have an aunt and uncle who came back from New York, and their grown kids they came too. And these, they would come for the summer or whatever, but these are New York City kids. I mean, these are folks we all have AARP cards now, but we were kids at the time. But they came again, they have a quality of life here that they couldn't afford in New York City. And so they come to Charleston, or they go to Atlanta, which is a lot more urban and faster than Charleston, but certainly slower than New York City or Jersey. So like everything else, the migration story is complex. It's complex.
Yeah, that's Jasmine, that makes me, I don't want to put you on the spot, but what you were saying earlier about, in particular, the beauty of this film's representation of intergenerational relationships between Black women, in particular older Black women, which is something we don't see nearly enough of on the screen or on pages. But I'm also thinking of the unborn child who appears with her blue ribbon in her hair. And I'm curious just how that portrait landed for you, and how she might, what she might be here to tell us, or what we might take away, as we think of this intergenerational portrait. It goes backward and it also goes forward, right? What might we take away from her? Maybe this is for everybody too. But Jasmine, I want to invite you in if you would be willing to hop in.
I don't know, but that was really beautiful and interesting to see. Hopefully that culture will still be instilled and taken on to future generations, because it is so beautiful to see. But yeah, I'm curious what others think.
I see little girls like that all the time when I go home. And to me, they're a symbol of hope for the future. Right? They're a symbol of a chance to take advantage of things that weren't accessible to me. Surely were not accessible to my mother, my grandmother, and so on back. And that's what I saw with the little girl. I mean, I saw the promise of the future. I saw the connection between the past and also the possibilities of the future.
I think it was the little girl embodies the hope of the tradition moving into the future. It's not an accident you have this happening turn of the century as well. So I think there's a lot of transition points in this film, and the hope that everything that Nana had in her is going to be in the now born child, and wherever they go, it's still going to be connecting there. And as I said, she got a chance to see her before she passed, and so that part of her will stay and continue to go down the line. And so I just saw it as a way to really get to keep the traditions that are rich in that
Right.
culture, in all culture, to keep
Yeah.
moving.
Those transgenerational lessons. I think about my grandmother, Rosa Murray Washington, who was born and raised on the Sea Islands and only had a sixth grade education. And that was considered a big deal back then. And she raised my uncles and my mom, who was the only girl. And she only had a sixth grade education, but she told my mother she was going to college. Now, how could she have known that? But she did. And my mom went to college. So for me, that's an important transgenerational lesson, to go from this woman who had to raise 5 kids on her own after my grandfather died in the country, to see her daughter graduate from Bennett College in Greensboro, North Carolina, all right, and to have all of her granddaughters not only graduate from college, but from graduate school and professional school. That lesson was, I have to believe that lesson was implanted very early on, long before I came along.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's lovely. Dr. Glick, do you want to hop in here?
I was just going to say something very brief, and maybe not as directly related to this question, but just hearing people comment for the past couple minutes about the major themes of the film, the intergenerational themes, stories of the Great Migration. I mean, it's one. These are all the things that make the film so powerful and resonant. It was a film that, I mean, Hollywood and the mainstream media industries were interested in, to some extent, in terms of festival recognition. I mean, it played at Sundance, it's critical praise, but really struggled to find a home in the commercial market, in the indie market at the time. I mean, this is something that Dash talks about, and some of her contemporaries, Charles Burnett, To Sleep with Anger, came out around the same time. Films that were sort of celebrated within critical circles, but couldn't find a home in the commercial market, in part because they were so nuanced and complex, and were dealing with questions of cultural geography in ways that, I mean, it wasn't as if people weren't interested in watching it, but Hollywood didn't know how to market it, and they didn't know how to distribute it at all. They failed miserably in that regard, and can see the advertisements and things like that just and lacking the kind of nuance and complexity that was present on the screen for the films. But I will say, just a very brief comment, that today, you do hear, Ava DuVernay, with so much creativity, with people of color working in film and media now, you do hear people talk directly about this film, Daughters of the Dust and Burnett. I mean, the persistence of these films in the cultural imagination definitely lived on, and this film in particular, and some of the other films from that late 80s, early 90s period, made a huge impact. And you hear a lot of different folks today talk about just the lasting impact of that work.
Before I'd even seen the movie, we were already talking about the impact of it, right? Like, we already had an idea about how important the movie was. Like, I didn't see it in 91. I saw it after the fact, right? But then the resonance has stayed. I'm thinking about all the times that's come up, even in the time I spent in Birmingham at the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. Like, we would do this quiz competition with area high schools, and that daughter Julie Dash was always one of these questions that would pop up because of the I won't say notoriety, the importance, the impact of having that wide release and being a Black woman filmmaker. It's something that we wanted people to know. Like, you needed to understand how important that was. And so it was great for the critical acclaim, but I think what was said was just right. They didn't know how to market it. They weren't aware of who it could resonate with. but that's not a new thing. I mean, we're still surprised about the impact of Black Panther 3 years ago. The fact that, something that the whole notion of Black characters carrying films to like a wide audience is still a new thing. But it's been there the whole time.
Right. Right.
But it's a new thing in the American experience, established experience.
I am not convinced that it is entirely new. I think for me, it's always about the money. And I also think it's about the fact that they don't know. I think you're right. They don't know how to market films that show Black people in this very complex and nuanced way. What they're very good at marketing is Black trauma and Black people acting a fool.
No, absolutely.
Because that makes money.
Yeah. And this is not new to us. This is not new to us, but new to the.
It's not new to us.
Right.
But yeah. I mean, that's the stuff that brings in the Benjamins. Do they still use that term anymore? See, I'm dating.
That's not gonna go.
Yeah. So, but I mean, but these kinds of films have always existed.
Oh yeah.
They've always existed.
Yeah. And been done well for decades. It's just that now the mainstream understands. Oh, we can market. We have.
There's an audience.
This can work.
They realize what many of us always knew. There's a willing audience that will show up and see these films. They will show up and see these films.
Exactly.
Black Panther here in Jonesboro, which is predominantly white. The theaters were packed for days. For days. That's how monumental and how impactful that film was.
And see, what's interesting, we're talking about Daughters of Dust 30 years after the fact.
Mm-hmm.
We'll be talking about the impact of that Black Panther movie 30 years from now.
Absolutely.
In the same way, because it opened the door for people who couldn't see it.
Right. Absolutely.
It's funny how these things work.
Yep. I'm so sorry. I'm gonna have to get off in a minute.
No, I was just going to say, first, Dr. Glick, his internet just went out, so he did not mean to just disappear from the conversation. So we
figured it.
He's texting me now he's texting me to apologize. But I don't want to keep y'all, but thank you so much for making for spending time this evening. In particular, Mr. Ward, you are in Eastern time, so this is it's 9 o'clock for us. So it's,
that's not a problem. This is I enjoyed the conversation. Thank you, Dr. Jones-Branch, for allowing me to share your space here. I appreciate it. Thank you, Jasmine, for putting all this together. So no problem at all. I'm used to this. We dealing with people all over the country. You gotta make these concessions.
Yeah, we so appreciate it, and thank you for making time and for sharing your wisdom and insight and expertise with us. It's so great.
I'm right up the road, so it's okay.
Well, thank you so much, Jasmine. Do you have last words you want to say too?
Yes, thank you everyone for joining this conversation. It was really beautiful, Dr. Jones-Branch, to hear about your connection to the Gola woman. I loved it so much. And Mr. Ahmad Ward, it was very interesting to hear about Mitchellville Museum. Hopefully I think you're doing amazing work there. So thank you, Dr. Jodan for moderating. You did amazing. And everyone who joined us today, thank you so much.
Thank you.
It was amazing.
Thank you, everyone.
Sorry about my internet. My internet was terrible. This panel was great. Thanks. The film was amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Y'all take care.
Good night, everybody. Bye-bye.
Good night.